Dyer is an Eastern Orthodox Christian presuppositional apologist. He's most known for promulgating and defending his own idiosyncratic version of TAG, the Transcendental Argument for the Existence of God. He's also infamous for, at times, being pretentious, dismissive, and whatever the hell this is.
Truth is found in the cocaine that I do before the debate.
Since Jay has become the current poster boy for the TAG argument, an argument he believes definitively proves the existence of the Eastern Orthodox formulation of God, let's see exactly how well he defends this argument and if his bluster matches his wit. The transcendental argument for the existence of God has taken different forms over the years, with its champions being the likes of Cornelius Van Til, the godfather of modern Christian presuppositionalism, and Greg Bahnsen, his protege. The argument usually takes the form of inferring that the existence of the Christian God is necessary for the possibility of rational thought, knowledge, and meaningful experience. Unlike traditional theistic arguments, which infer God from some intelligible experience in reality, TAG argues that one cannot even begin to speak of an intelligible reality without a God to ground it in. TAG argues that God is the necessary precondition for the intelligibility of reality itself. Without the Christian God, there would be no knowledge, logic, uniformity of nature, or objective morality at all. Enter J. Dyer.
I've been a TAG proponent for 20 years. I know it very well.
Jay defends his own version of the TAG argument that, while not identical to the formulations of Bahnsen and Van Til, still maintains roughly the same logical form. Here's Jay's articulation of the argument.
My argument is that only the Christian God and Christian metaphysics and epistemology and revelation could tell us the means by which the transcendental categories are grounded, namely in the personal God of Christian Trinitarian theism.
So, Jay is putting forward a form of the presuppositional principle known as the impossibility of the contrary. That is, the Christian worldview, and only the Christian worldview, can possibly ground the preconditions that are required for intelligible experience and knowledge. Jay calls these preconditions the transcendentals, and among them he lists universals, ethics, words and meaning, the self, laws of logic, and mathematical entities, among many more. It's these preconditions, or transcendentals, that, according to Jay, must be coherently grounded, and it's only the Christian paradigm and the triune God himself that can possibly provide such a foundation. Now, while Jay can obviously articulate his version of TAG colloquially, here's where he begins to run into issues. Any philosophical argument, if it's valid and sound, should have the ability to be formally placed into a logical syllogism. If an argument can't possibly be placed into a valid logical syllogism, then it isn't a valid argument to begin with. Formulating an argument in syllogistic form is important when an argument needs to be logically dissected in order to determine if it's valid and sound. Jay, who has some graduate background in philosophy, should be apprised of this and should make it a priority to clearly and unambiguously formally structure his argument. And here's where Jay has struggled. He hasn't been able to consistently articulate his argument in a formal and structured logical manner. In Jay's debate with atheist Matt Dillahunty a few years back, Jay gave his opening statement, and during Dillahunty's opening statement, Dillahunty immediately articulated the following.
I will say, I'm not convinced that I actually heard an argument in all of that. One of the things is that I'm not necessarily requiring that we have, a fully constructed syllogism, but if we could get close to that, because...
So, Dillahunty asked Jay for at least some semblance of a syllogism, but to no avail. Jay would be unwilling or unable to provide such a structured argument, and Dillahunty would have to ask 2 more times for Jay to formalize his argument during the entirety of the debate.
That would prove that they are valid arguments in a logical sense, if something leads to a reductio. Right.
Well, if you do this again, maybe putting TAG in a syllogism that can be addressed, okay, maybe we can get closer to an argument. But my concern isn't whether or not the argument is valid as so much as whether or not it's sound. And if I'm not presented with some sort of syllogistic form, I can't even in a conversational thing. It is almost impossible, the way we speak and communicate, to say that's an invalid argument because validity goes to the structure. And
So despite TAG being Jay's go-to argument for God's existence, he didn't come prepared with the syllogism, nor was he able to construct one at the request of Dillahunty. To Jay's credit, he did acknowledge Dillahunty's request for a syllogism and claimed he would do his best to formulate one, but instead, he began rambling off on the transcendentals themselves and never got around to formulating any semblance of a logical syllogism.
Great comments there and questions from Matt. So first he asked for a syllogism. So I think I can oblige this to a degree and say that, I could state it like this. There are many transcendental categories. I'll list some of the ones that I think are strong, and I don't mind that Matt included the idea of truth. I don't have a problem including truth. There's plenty actually.
2 hours later.
Scientific methodology, which I was kind of focusing on in the opening statement, but in life in general, right? I mean, throughout life, we assume these kinds of things all throughout. We assume.
So, throughout the entire almost 3-hour debate, Jay was unable to clearly articulate his position as a structured logical syllogism, despite the fact that it was his argument specifically that was the focal point of the entire debate. In Jay's debate with philosopher Dr. Alex Malpass, which was a debate exclusively over the tag argument, Jay ran into the same problem. 15 minutes into the debate, Dr. Malpass asked Jay to state his argument in a syllogism, and yet again, Jay restates the argument colloquially and then begins rambling, never getting around to Dr. Malpass's request.
I'm still trying to get a grip on what the form of the argument actually is, though. And maybe it would be helpful if you could state it as premises and a conclusion.
Well, the argument again is that if one accepts that there are transcendental preconditions, which some philosophers dispute that notion, I'm well aware of that. For example, a lot of, say, modern transcendental arguments are like linguistic categories that Carl Otto Appel does work in. Other people like.
This debate ended up getting stuck in the mud in an almost hour-long discussion on whether or not Aristotle's defense of the law of non-contradiction constitutes a proper form of transcendental argument, a pitfall that might have been avoided if Jay could have promulgated his argument in a proper syllogistic form. In fact, this issue did not evade the attention of those watching the debate either, as towards the end of the debate, the moderator felt the need to also request a clear structured syllogism for Jay's argument. Jay again attempted to oblige the moderator, but spent too much time filibustering and wasn't able to clearly promulgate 2 premises and a conclusion.
You're discussing a tag argument. So is there possibly a way you can put it in a more structured syllogistic form? I just go from the premises to the conclusion real quick. Is there some form of that we can analyze that way? Is that okay?
Yeah, let me say it like this. All philosophical systems or worldviews have fundamental assumptions that relate to metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, right? I would say that so that's my first premise. When we examine those presuppositions or categories or possibilities of experience, et cetera, that make up those 3 branches of philosophy, we encounter a host of things that are assumed, things like the existence of the self, Kant's categories that, like he was mentioning earlier, abstract conceptual entities, meaning behind sentences, the existence of the external world, the existence of the past. This is another one that people forget. Transcendental unity of apperception is one you could use that Kant talked about. That objects have identity over time is another one. So, you can start listing these types of really kind of big level questions that seem to be necessary for the possibility of knowledge or discourse or ethics or whatever. And so the final conclusion after we look at those is that the way to give a meta level justification and explanation for the coherence of those things is the existence of the Orthodox view, the existence of God in the Orthodox view.
Alex, you want to respond to that? If you can.
Notice the moderator seemed dumbfounded because Jay presented his syllogism as only 1 premise and a conclusion, thereby missing a crucial middle premise in his argument. Jay's structured argument came out to the following. Premise 1. All philosophical systems or worldviews have fundamental assumptions that relate to metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. Jay gave no clear discernible formulation of a premise 2. He merely listed what some of these assumptions or preconditions are, and he subsequently jumped straight to a conclusion, which was the way to give a meta-level justification and explanation for the coherence of these assumptions is the existence of the Orthodox God. No hyperbole is intended on my end, but this is one of the most laughable attempts at a logical syllogism I've ever witnessed. Even though premise 2 is missing, which is amusing in and of itself, I don't believe there's any possible proposition that could be substituted in for premise 2 that would make Jay's argument valid, let alone sound. This argument is completely vacuous. Granted, Jay was asked to construct a syllogism on the fly, but, number one, Jay knew he would be defending this argument in the debate and should have come prepared, and number two, he's a seasoned student of philosophy and has, according to his own words, been promulgating TAG for 20 years.
I've been a TAG proponent for 20 years. I know it very well.
So, there's really no excuse for Jay to be this abysmal at clearly and succinctly formulating his own version of TAG into a structured syllogism. Now, it's not all doom and gloom for those in Jay's camp. Jay must have learned his lesson from these debates because sometime later he began to finally at least attempt to prepare TAG in a valid syllogistic form.
Can we see that? X is the necessary condition of Y. Y, therefore X. Now, granted, I know that no atheist is going to accept that when I plug in God or the preconditions or anything like that, but the structure of the argument is not, my argument is God exists, therefore God exists. Okay, do you see that anywhere in that? Did I ever say, I know God exists because God exists. I presuppose God, therefore God exists. Do you see that in it? Is that the same as this? No, it's not. This is... There's nothing, it should be self-evident in a way. I don't believe in self-evident truth, but in a limited sense, right? It should be obvious to any reasonable person that this is not a fallacy. If X is a necessary condition of Y, and if Y is the case, then clearly, by necessity, X is the case. It's very simple. Okay, it's not rocket science. I know people get confused over transcendental arguments. They think this is some wild, obtuse, out there thing. It's actually really simple.
Indeed, TAG is so simple that Jay has struggled immensely to get it into this valid syllogistic form. On the contrary, it appears that Jay's argument is so convoluted that it requires 20 years just to get it this polished and refined. Nevertheless, it's endearing to see Jay finally making progress. However, in that last clip, notice that Jay still only gave the form of his argument. He didn't actually plug in any particulars into the variables. Nevertheless, he finally does so here.
Let me put it this way. Christianity is the net. So I like X is the necessary condition of Y. Y, therefore X, right? So Christianity is the necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge. And the way I'm getting to that is that for the, quote, possibility of knowledge, that would include all the transcendental categories. Because if you toss out one of them, knowledge is no longer justified.
So Jay's TAG argument, 20 years in the making, is this. Premise 1, Christianity is the necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge. Premise 2, knowledge is possible. Conclusion, therefore, Christianity is true. Now that Jay can finally place his argument neatly into the bin of logical structure, let's see how well he defends it. Consider first how high of a burden this argument places on itself. The TAG argument doesn't merely claim that the Orthodox conception of God provides a sufficient condition for the transcendentals and preconditions, and thereby for the possibility of knowledge. No, this argument makes a much more grandiose claim. The argument makes the claim that the Christian God and the Christian paradigm, and only the Christian paradigm, can possibly provide the grounding necessary for the preconditions of knowledge. Again, the argument is not merely that because Christianity is true, therefore knowledge and intelligibility are grounded. The argument is that knowledge and intelligibility can only possibly be grounded if Christianity is true. The main burden of this argument is located in premise 1. That's where the metaphysical and epistemic heavy lifting is done. This is the premise Jay needs to rigorously and robustly defend and justify. And how does he go about justifying this claim? Let's watch more from Jay's debate with Matt Dillahunty to see Jay's defense of his argument. Listen carefully to what he says.
The argument that I made was that even more fundamental than numbers or the concept of information or words is all of these transcendental categories that are presupposed in communication, in life, in logic, in ethics, and whatever. And they make sense in a paradigm, in a complete worldview where we have the kind of God that we believe in. That is the argument. Now,
notice what Jay said. He articulated that the transcendentals make sense in a paradigm or complete worldview with the Christian God. And he even emphasizes this by saying that is the argument. Now, what exactly is wrong with this? Well, all Jay is really saying is that Christianity is a sufficient condition for the grounding of the transcendentals, or for the grounding of the possibility of knowledge. That is, he's saying that Christianity can account for the possibility of knowledge. But even if this were true, as we already articulated, that's not the burden that TAG requires. TAG is predicated on the Christian God being a necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge, not a sufficient condition. Jay's articulation here is nowhere near being enough to reach the burden he has set for himself that only Christianity and no other possible worldview can provide a grounding for the possibility of knowledge. Remember, TAG is a form of the principle known as the impossibility of the contrary. Jay has not shown that worldviews contrary to Christianity are impossible. To Jay's credit, he understands that his argument requires more. He understands that his argument requires him to effectively demonstrate that worldviews or paradigms opposing Christianity must be shown to be false. But watch how Jay rhetorically maneuvers when it comes time to actually satisfy this burden of his argument.
My argument is that only the Christian God and Christian metaphysics and epistemology and revelation could tell us the means by which the transcendental categories are grounded, namely in the personal God of Christian Trinitarian theism. So there's no contradiction in that, because that's my position, contrasted to the opposing worldview, which is wrought with contradictions. That's the argument. People think that the argument, they don't understand that it's comparing two paradigms. That's what the argument is.
Okay, no, I get it. That's exactly what I wanted to ask you. So just to clarify, let's say that, just a guess, I'm sure there's more, but let's say that the maximum there would be is like 30 paradigms, right? There's probably many more, there's probably hundreds, but at the end of the day, you're saying that when you investigate each one on their own merits, right, that the only one that stands on his feet is the God one. But
the God one. I mean, I don't even know what that means.
The Orthodox Christian worldview. That's what I mean.
Yeah, okay. I mean, can you give me another worldview that gives an account for universals, the one and the many, the past, the self, the trans?
No, I can't. I can't do that. No.
Notice what occurred in that exchange. Towards the latter half of the video, Jay shifted the burden of proof to his interlocutor. Keep this in mind. Jay is the individual promulgating the TAG argument. The argument is his, and his alone, to defend and justify. Thus, the burden rests with him in order to justify that the argument is indeed sound. Instead of satisfying this burden, Jay asks the individual he's dialoguing with if he is able to provide a competing worldview or paradigm that accomplishes what he believes the Christian paradigm accomplishes. This is a textbook fallacy of shifting the burden of proof. It's not Jay's opponent's job to erect a competing paradigm that accounts for knowledge or transcendentals. It's Jay's job, and solely Jay's job, to demonstrate that such a paradigm is impossible. This is actually an issue that has plagued presuppositionalism for decades. It's essentially the modus operandi of presuppositionalists to shift the burden of proof. Van Til and Greg Bahnsen were guilty of this as well. When a presuppositionalist claims that their worldview alone can account for and ground the possibility of knowledge, and they're subsequently asked to justify this claim, they shift the burden to their interlocutor and ask how their interlocutor, who's usually an atheist or non-believer, can account for the possibility of knowledge on their worldview. This is a fallacy. Again, it's a shifting of the burden of proof. Even if the interlocutor was unable to account for the possibility of knowledge, this wouldn't entail that the presuppositionalist is vindicated. The presuppositionalist has to show not that any particular non-Christian paradigm fails to ground the possibility of knowledge, but that no possible paradigm other than the Christian paradigm can do so. Asking any particular interlocutor how they ground knowledge doesn't accomplish this. And what we're witnessing here is the fatal flaw in Jay's argumentation, or lack thereof. I've never witnessed him take on the burden of his own argument. He always fallaciously shifts the burden of proof to the person he's dialoguing with. Case in point. Consider the dialogue Jay had with Derek from MythVision. Despite the fact that Derek's wheelhouse is not philosophy and epistemology, Derek appropriately asks Jay to justify tag, and, like a moth to flame, Jay fallaciously shifts the burden of proof.
Just prove to me that you have the correct standard, the correct epistemic foundation. Show me how you know that yours is true.
Because of the impossibility of the contrary, because the other worldviews, they mess up at a fundamental level when it comes to the basics of a worldview, epistemology, metaphysics.
How do you know that? How do you know that they've messed up?
Because you can demonstrate it, like as I'm arguing with you, when you don't give an account for your arbitrary starting point, we already know that.
So give me your starting point. I've asked you for that evidence, not
right.
I'm
Notice that Derek very aptly asked Jay how he knows that the impossibility of the contrary is true. And what does Jay do? He claims that the impossibility of the contrary is demonstrated through instances such as his current dialogue with Derek, wherein Derek is required to justify his epistemic grounding. This is not a justification of the impossibility of the contrary. Don't get me wrong, asking anyone what their ultimate epistemic grounding is an important philosophical question, sure. Nevertheless, Derek's personal epistemic grounding is completely irrelevant to Jay's own argument for tag. Jay shouldn't need Derek in order to argue for tag. Tag either stands or falls on its own, irrespective of who happens to be dialoguing with Jay at that particular moment. Even if Derek were personally unable to ground the possibility of knowledge, this wouldn't thereby justify Jay's version of tag one iota. Again, tag is either valid and sound or it isn't. Derek or anyone else's specific epistemic paradigm contributes absolutely nothing with respect to grounding tag. Instead of Jay doing the metaphysical heavy lifting, he fallaciously plays logical hot potato with the burden of proof. At the risk of belaboring the point, here's another exchange with Jay and a very astute atheist over tag, and watch again how Jay shifts the burden of proof.
Well, I'm wondering what the argument is that only Orthodox Christianity answers this questions in a way that kind of allows for the possibility of knowledge, and none of the other worldviews answer the questions in a way which does allow for the possibility of knowledge.
So again, we would walk through different versions, different steps, different takes. So why don't we use your worldview as an example?
So again, notice what takes place here. Jay's interlocutor asks Jay very clearly how Orthodox Christianity grounds the possibility of knowledge in a way that precludes any other worldview or paradigm from doing the same. That is to say, the interlocutor is asking Jay for a justification of the impossibility of the contrary. And what is Jay's response? His response is to put his interlocutor's worldview under the epistemic microscope to see if it can ground the possibility of knowledge. This is again a shifting of the burden of proof. The interlocutor's ability or inability to ground knowledge on their worldview is irrelevant to Jay's defense of tag. Jay should theoretically be able to justify tag all on his own without any interlocutor whatsoever. Think about things this way. Imagine you happened upon a book that laid out a deductive mathematical proof. This proof is either valid and sound on its own merits or it's not. The validity of the proof is not predicated on who happens to read it or interact with it. Similarly, Jay's deductive argument for tag, which is a supposed proof for the existence of God, is either valid and sound on its own merits or it isn't. It doesn't derive its soundness from whomever Jay happens to be dialoguing with at the moment and how he interacts with their worldview. That's ridiculous. And before any viewers think I'm mischaracterizing Jay's views presently, continue to watch his interaction with this specific atheist.
What's the argument for this premise?
Well, it's an argument about the possibility of arguing at all. So the way I argue it, it has two moves that we make. So depending upon who the argument is against, it's an impossibility of the contrary. And then the positive side of the argument is the Christian metaphysic and its claims.
So you're just not talking to anybody in particular. You're just kind of writing.
No. The argument is always, but by the very necessity of the argument, it's an argument of comparison of paradigms. So it has to have some argument that I'm comparing against, some position, some worldview. So what's your position?
So, note that Jay explicitly articulated that the justification for the impossibility of the contrary will, quote, depend on who the argument is against, end quote, and that the argument is a comparison of paradigms, so there has to be some competing paradigm that he's arguing against. First, remember that the impossibility of the contrary is a claim that no other possible worldview or paradigm can account for and ground the possibility of knowledge. This is a sweeping claim that doesn't rely on any specific worldview or paradigm to argue against. Jay has to show that all worldviews that are mutually exclusive to Christianity can't get the job done epistemically, and that his can. So why in the world would the impossibility of the contrary depend on who Jay is arguing against? It wouldn't. This is just Jay's way to fallaciously shift the burden of proof, as we've seen he likes to do. Second, Jay is correct to note that TAG is, in a sense, a comparison of competing paradigms, so that there has to be at least one paradigm he's arguing against in theory. However, this doesn't require an interlocutor. Jay doesn't actually need an atheist sitting in front of him in order to demonstrate that an atheist paradigm is untenable. He just needs to engage in the comparison himself and do the intellectual heavy lifting on his own, which he appears to be allergic to. Nevertheless, there's more than one atheistic paradigm or worldview, and there's more than one paradigm that is mutually exclusive with Orthodox Christianity. Atheism certainly isn't the only one. Jay must demonstrate that all possible paradigms and worldviews other than Christianity are epistemically and metaphysically unfit to ground knowledge. Remember, that's what claiming that Christianity is the necessary condition for the possibility of knowledge entails. That's a tall task, and guess what? It's not going to be accomplished by shifting the burden of proof to whatever interlocutor Jay happens to be dialoguing with at the time. Refuting any random atheist that happens to be sitting in front of Jay doesn't ground Christianity as a necessary condition for knowledge. It just doesn't accomplish that. Jay is trying to play chess, but he's playing checkers instead. So Jay is simply incredibly confused in the way that he goes about attempting to justify TAG. Now, I could be mistaken, but I don't believe Jay has ever published a formal academic paper on the Transcendental Argument for the existence of God, despite promulgating this argument as the best possible argument for God for 20 years and having a background in philosophy. And after watching countless hours of Jay's debates regarding TAG, I can see why. Jay is simply not able to bear the burden of justification that the argument requires. As we've seen, he's had significant issues even structuring the argument in a proper syllogistic form. And when it comes time to justify his premises and satisfy his burden of proof, he fallaciously shifts the burden to whomever he's dialoguing with in order to avoid the logical responsibilities of his own argument. This is why Jay hasn't written a formal academic paper for TAG, because he knows he can't play this game on the level of philosophical academia. Jay's journey with the Transcendental Argument for the existence of God reveals a significant struggle to meet the rigorous demands of philosophical argumentation. Despite his confidence and rhetorical flair, Jay's inability to consistently articulate TAG in a valid syllogistic form, coupled with his persistent habit of fallaciously shifting the burden of proof, undermines the strength of his defense. The TAG argument, with its bold claim that only the Christian worldview can ground the preconditions for knowledge, requires a level of precision and justification that Jay has yet to deliver. His debates often devolve into rhetorical maneuvers rather than substantive defenses of his premises, leaving the argument's validity and soundness in question. Without a formal defense to solidify his position, and given his challenges in live discussions, it's clear that Jay's version of TAG remains more of a provocative talking point than a philosophically robust proof. For those seeking a definitive case for the Orthodox Christian God through TAG, Jay's efforts fall short of the mark. Perhaps with future refinement and a willingness to bear the full burden of his claims, Jay could make a compelling case. But for now, his bluster far outpaces his wit. Thanks for watching.
Truth is found in the cocaine that I do before the debate.